What if one of the most mysterious places on Earth isn't just unexplored, but deliberately left untouched? In the remote highlands of western Tibet, there is a mountain surrounded by details that scientists still cannot fully explain. Perfect geometric alignment, physical effects on the human body that appear measurable, yet inconsistent, and a pattern of restricted access that raises more questions than answers. Some of these phenomena can be approached through known science. Others remain, quietly, outside of it. So the real question is not just what Mount Kailash is, but why, after all this time, it still stands beyond full understanding. At over 4,500 meters above sea level, the environment here already feels extreme. The air carries roughly half the oxygen found at lower altitudes. Winters can drop to -40 degrees Celsius, while summers rarely exceed 5 degrees. Ultraviolet radiation is intense enough to affect exposed skin within minutes. The terrain stretches outward in vast rocky plains, broken only by scattered nomadic settlements and a few isolated monasteries. It is a place that feels stripped down, almost resistant to sustained human presence. And yet, rising out of this stark landscape, there is something that draws attention immediately, not because it blends in, but because it does not. Mount Kailash stands at 6,638 meters, with a sharply defined peak and 4 distinct faces. At first glance, that might not seem unusual for a Himalayan mountain, but the more closely it is observed, the more it begins to deviate from expectation. Unlike neighboring peaks, which are heavily covered in glaciers, Kailash remains largely free of ice. And more strikingly, there has never been a confirmed successful ascent, not because it is technically impossible, but because climbing it is prohibited. Across 4 major belief systems, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Bon, there exists a shared conclusion that developed independently over centuries. This mountain is sacred, a central axis of the world, and not meant to be climbed. That alone is rare. But what makes it even more unusual is how consistently that boundary has been respected. Thousands of pilgrims visit each year. They walk around the mountain in a ritual circuit known as the Kora, but none attempt to go beyond it. The limit is not enforced by physical barriers, but by something more enduring: tradition, belief, and perhaps something less easily defined. Still, belief alone does not explain the physical characteristics of the mountain itself. Because when you look at Kailash from a geological perspective, one feature stands out immediately. Its 4 faces are remarkably flat, deviating less than 1% from a true plane. Even more unusual, each face is aligned almost perfectly, with the cardinal directions north, south, east, and west, with an error margin of less than 2 degrees. This level of symmetry is not observed in surrounding peaks. Geologists do propose an explanation, typically referring to structural anisotropy, a condition where rock fractures form in consistent orientations, guiding erosion along those lines. It is a real and accepted process, but it generally accounts for partial symmetry, not 4 nearly perfect planes aligned simultaneously with cardinal directions. That level of precision sits at the edge of what standard geological models comfortably explain. In the late 20th century, researcher Ernst Muldashev noted another detail that added to the discussion. The angles of Kailash's faces appear to closely resemble those of the pyramids within the Giza pyramid complex. He also suggested that the outer surface of the mountain looks denser and more uniform than the rock within its internal fractures, as if the exterior layer differs in composition. These observations have not been conclusively disproven, but they have also not been fully addressed within mainstream geology. Then, in 1999, a group of Slovak climbers received official permission to attempt an ascent. For a brief moment, it seemed that direct study might finally happen, but the permit was withdrawn soon after, following coordinated objections from multiple religious organizations. The climb was cancelled, and no similar attempt has been approved since. So the mountain remains, perfectly aligned, unclimbed, and only partially understood, which leads to a quieter, more persistent question if this is entirely natural. Why has it never been fully studied up close? And if it is not, what exactly are we looking at? Because Kailash does not present itself as a solved problem. It stands there more like a boundary, and everything around it only makes that boundary more difficult to ignore. But the structure of the mountain is only what you can see, because once people begin to move around it, once they step into the path that has been followed for centuries, something else begins to emerge. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually enough that those who experience it tend to notice, and more importantly, remember. Pilgrims who perform the Kora, the ritual circuit around Mount Kailash, often describe a physical change that is difficult to ignore. Over the course of just a few days, their hair and nails appear to grow faster than usual. This is not described as a vague sensation or subjective impression. In several cases, it has been recorded in measurable terms. Individuals who noted the length of their nails before beginning the journey reported growth over 3 days that would normally take closer to 2 weeks. At first, this sounds like the kind of detail that could be dismissed as exaggeration, especially in a place already shaped by strong spiritual expectations. But the pattern becomes harder to ignore when you look at the sources. Tibetan chronicles mention it. British officers traveling through the region in the 19th century wrote about similar observations. Soviet geologists working in the 1960s included comparable notes in their field reports. And even in the early 2000s, modern expeditions have described the same effect. Different time periods, different cultural contexts, no shared narrative. And yet, the same detail appears again. Science approaches this cautiously, as it should. One explanation focuses on biology. High-altitude environments can affect the human body in complex ways. Reduced oxygen levels, increased ultraviolet exposure, physical exertion, and changes in diet could, in theory, influence metabolic processes and cellular regeneration. It is a reasonable starting point, but it leaves one important question unanswered. Why does this effect not appear evenly throughout the entire journey? Why do people consistently report that it becomes more noticeable in certain sections of the route, almost as if there are specific points where something changes? That detail shifts the discussion, because it suggests that whatever is happening may not be uniform, it may be localized, and that leads to a different kind of question, not just about the body, but about the environment itself. In the mid-20th century, Soviet astrophysicist Nikolai Kozyrev proposed a controversial idea that, while not widely accepted, still appears in discussions around unusual phenomena. He suggested that time might not behave as a fixed constant everywhere, but could vary slightly depending on physical conditions. His work explored the possibility that certain environments might influence the rate at which processes occur. Though not in a way that would be easily noticeable under normal circumstances, his theories were never fully integrated into mainstream physics. But some of his experimental results, particularly those involving sensitive mechanical systems, produced anomalies that were not easily explained. If you place that idea next to the observations reported around Kailash, it introduces a possibility that is difficult to confirm, but equally difficult to dismiss entirely. What if the body is not accelerating on its own? What if the conditions in certain locations subtly alter how processes unfold over time? It is not a conclusion, but it reframes the question. And then there is the mountain itself, not just its overall shape, but specific features along its surface that seem to interact with the surrounding space in unusual ways. On the western and southwestern slopes, there are rock formations that appear distinctly concave, forming curved surfaces across multiple levels of elevation. These are not random indentations. They appear with a kind of consistency, similar angles, similar positioning, almost as if they follow a pattern rather than chance. Several expeditions have described them in comparable terms, often likening them to large parabolic structures. Ernst Muldashev suggested that these formations might act as natural focusing surfaces, potentially concentrating solar, geomagnetic, or even acoustic energy into specific areas. In his interpretation, this could be connected to the localized effects reported by those moving around the mountain. Mainstream geology offers a simpler explanation: differential erosion, where softer material wears away faster than harder layers, gradually forming concave shapes. Again, the process itself is not disputed, but the pattern remains difficult to ignore. Why do these formations appear here, in such a structured way, while nearby mountains with similar compositions do not show the same features? Why has there been no detailed, publicly available measurement of electromagnetic or acoustic activity in these areas? And why does access for this kind of research remain so limited? The formations remain where they are, visible, consistent, and unexplored in ways that might answer the question more directly. And if that raises uncertainty, the southern face of the mountain introduces something even more difficult: to explain features that are not subtle at all, but unmistakably visible from a distance. Because at around 5,000 meters above sea level, long vertical grooves appear across the rock surface. They run downward in parallel lines, relatively uniform in width, extending from near the upper sections toward the base. They do not follow the irregular patterns typical of erosion. They do not spread outward as they descend. They remain straight, consistent, almost deliberate in appearance. Geologists who have reviewed satellite imagery often describe them cautiously, referring to atypical morphology for the type of rock present. Standard explanations, water erosion, thermal fracturing, glacial movement, do not fully match the observed pattern. And once again, there is a familiar limitation. No detailed direct field study of these formations has been widely published, not because there is no interest, but because access remains restricted, so the grooves remain clear enough to see, difficult enough to explain. And still, after all this time, without a definitive answer, if the mountain itself raises questions, what lies beyond it begins to challenge something even deeper, the assumption that we understand who lived in these regions and how far back that history really goes. Roughly 100 kilometers north of Mount Kailash, within the cliffs of the Mustang region, there is a landscape that at first seems empty. Just steep rock faces rising sharply above the valley, some reaching heights of over 100 meters. But once you begin to look more closely, something unusual starts to appear. Small openings, scattered across the cliffs, then more and more, until it becomes clear that these are not random formations, but entrances, thousands of them, embedded directly into the vertical rock walls. There are believed to be around 10,000 caves in total. Some are natural, but most are clearly man-made. Inside, they are not simple hollow spaces. Many contain structured rooms, narrow corridors, carved doorways, niches for lamps, and traces of wall paintings that have survived for centuries. The level of detail suggests long-term use, not temporary shelter. But what makes this even more difficult to explain is their position. These caves are located at heights where there is no visible access, no stairways, no carved footholds, no remains of scaffolding, no indication of how people could have reached them using known methods available at the time, just sheer vertical rock, and openings placed with precision. When archaeological teams from Nepal and the United States began studying the site in the 1990s, they could not simply walk into these structures. They had to descend from above using ropes, often supported by helicopters. Inside, they found manuscripts written in Sanskrit and Tibetan, dating back between 500 and 1,200 years. They found murals depicting religious imagery, but in styles that do not fully align with any known regional school. And in some chambers, they found human remains, bodies, preserved in dry conditions, positioned in what appear to be deliberate postures. One skeleton in particular was dated to around the 2nd century BCE, more than 2,000 years ago, long before any established state structure is recorded in that area. Which leads to a question that is difficult to answer directly: who built these caves, at heights that even today require advanced equipment to access? And how did they reach them in the first place? There is no clear explanation. Most of the caves remain unexplored. Access is limited, research progresses slowly, and whatever remains inside the unopened chambers is still unknown. But based on what has already been found, it suggests that this was not a simple settlement. It was something organized, something intentional, and something that does not fully fit into the historical timeline we expect. And then, about 100 kilometers west of Kailash, the pattern shifts again, but this time, it is not hidden in cliffs. It is fully visible. A city, built at an altitude of around 3,600 meters, carved into a rugged mountain formation. Not ruins in the usual sense, but an entire structure that still stands. This place is known as Tsaparang. It was once the capital of the Kingdom of Guj. Between the 9th and 17th centuries, Guj was a significant regional power. At its peak, it is believed to have supported a population of around 100,000 people. It had its own system of governance, active trade networks, and a distinct cultural identity, particularly in Buddhist art and architecture. In 1630, a Portuguese Jesuit missionary, Antonio de Andrade, described the city as active, populated, and well-developed. And then, within a few decades, everything changed. By the time explorers returned in the 19th century, the city had been abandoned. Not destroyed, not burned, not looted, but left behind. The structures remained intact. Murals still covered the walls. Objects were left where they had been used. And in the underground passages, there were skeletons, hundreds of them, Men, women, children, no clear signs of widespread disease. No evidence of fire or sudden destruction. The commonly accepted explanation refers to an invasion in 1635, when forces from Ladakh are believed to have taken control of the region. The ruling family was captured, and the population is said to have fled. But that explanation leaves questions. Who were the individuals found in the underground chambers? Why did they remain? And what exactly happened in those final moments? Because the city does not show signs of a chaotic collapse. It feels paused, as if something ended, but not in a way that was fully recorded. Even today, access to Tsaparang is controlled, often justified by preservation efforts. Large sections of the underground structures have not been systematically explored or publicly documented, which means that part of the story is still missing, not hidden in the sense of being invisible, but simply unfinished. If the caves suggest a past we don't fully understand, and the abandoned city points to a disappearance that history cannot clearly explain, then what lies at the foot of Mount Kailash feels different. It is not something buried. It is not something lost. It is something visible, present, and still unfolding in real time. And yet, even now, it resists a complete explanation. At the southern base of the mountain, there are two lakes. They sit almost side by side, separated only by a narrow strip of land. Same altitude, same climate, same surrounding terrain, and yet, in every meaningful way, they are fundamentally different. The first is Lake Manasarova. Its water is fresh, clear, a deep, almost luminous blue that changes subtly depending on the light. At around 4,550 meters above sea level, it is one of the highest freshwater lakes in the world. Life exists here. Birds gather along its shores. Fish move beneath the surface. Pilgrims travel long distances to reach it, not just to see it, but to enter the water itself. In Hindu tradition, it is believed to have been created by Brahma. In Tibetan texts, it is often referred to as a living lake, associated with purification and renewal. Then, directly beside it, there is the second lake, Rakshastal. Its water is salt, darker in color, almost still in appearance, with a surface that reflects less and absorbs more. There are few birds, no visible fish, almost no signs of life. Locally, it is often described as a dead lake, or sometimes more ominously, a place associated with negative forces. Pilgrims who walk the sacred circuit around Kailash tend to keep their distance from it, choosing instead to remain closer to Manasarova. What makes this difficult to understand is not their symbolic contrast, it is their physical proximity. In most natural environments, two lakes that sit this close to each other at the same altitude, under the same weather conditions, with the same surrounding geology would share at least some basic characteristics. Over time, differences tend to balance out, especially when there is any form of connection between them. And in this case there is. A natural channel, known as Gangachu, links the two lakes. At certain times, water from Manasarova has been observed flowing into Rakshastal through this channel. Tibetan texts describe this event as meaningful, almost symbolic, the living lake, extending toward the dead one. But from a hydrological perspective, this raises a straightforward question. Why does the contrast remain so strong? Why does one lake stay fresh while the other remains saline? Why does life thrive in one and almost disappear in the other? There are possible explanations: differences in evaporation rates, variations in underground mineral deposits, subtle distinctions in inflow and drainage patterns. Each of these could contribute, but none of them, on their own, fully account for the persistence of such a clear and stable contrast over time. And then there are the observations that go beyond chemistry. Some travelers and researchers have reported seeing a faint bluish glow on the surface of Manasarova at night. Not a reflection, not a passing effect of light, but a subtle luminescence that appears without an obvious biological source. Bioluminescent microorganisms have been suggested as a possibility, but as with many other phenomena in this region, there has been no consistent, systematic study that confirms or fully explains it. So the lakes remain, side by side. One active, one quiet, one supporting life, the other holding almost none. And above them, Kailash rises in silence, unchanged, as if observing a contrast that has existed far longer than any explanation we have managed to construct. At some point, it becomes difficult not to ask whether this difference is purely environmental or whether there is something more subtle influencing the conditions here, something not immediately visible but consistently present. The lakes do not answer. They simply exist, presenting the contrast, holding it in place, and leaving the question open. By this point, the pattern is no longer subtle. A mountain that resists symmetry in all the ways it shouldn't. Physical effects that don't behave consistently across space. Structures that resemble intention more than randomness. A civilization that vanished without leaving a clear conclusion. Two lakes that remain fundamentally different despite sharing the same conditions. Individually, each of these can be approached. Together, they begin to feel connected. And then, just to the northwest of Mount Kailash, there is a place where even observation itself starts to break down. It does not appear clearly on standard maps. Not labeled, not detailed. In some publicly available Chinese maps, it shows up as a blank section, an area without terrain, without markings, without the usual layers of geographic information. In a time when satellite imagery can map nearly every corner of the planet with precision, that absence stands out more than any visible feature. Locally, it is sometimes referred to as a black zone, but the name is less important than what happens when people attempt to enter it. Expeditions that have approached this area at different times, from different directions, tend to describe a similar sequence. At first, nothing unusual. The terrain appears consistent with the surrounding region. But then, gradually, instruments begin to behave unpredictably. Compasses lose stability. The needle drifts, then rotates without settling. GPS devices stop responding or display coordinates that do not match the actual position. At first, it can be explained as interference, environmental disruption, equipment error, but then the effect continues and becomes more difficult to dismiss. Mechanical watches, devices that rely on internal motion rather than external signals, begin to lose time, not by seconds, but by noticeable amounts after only a few hours within the area. And when individuals leave the zone, the watches return to normal operation. That detail changes the nature of the observation because it suggests that the effect is not limited to electronic systems. It suggests that something more fundamental may be involved. These reports are not recent. They appear in expedition records from the early 20th century, long before GPS existed. Different groups, different purposes, similar descriptions. Which raises a question that becomes harder to ignore the more it repeats. What kind of environmental condition could influence both magnetic orientation and mechanical timekeeping at the same time? During the 1960s and 70s, Soviet geophysicists working in the region recorded anomalies in the geomagnetic field. Not random fluctuations, but structured variations, patterns that appeared to center not on a visible geological feature, but on a specific point in space. Some of these findings were partially released decades later. Others remain restricted. One participant from those expeditions later gave an interview, years after the work had been completed, and in that interview, he made a statement that does not explain anything directly, but leaves a lasting impression. He said they were told the matter had been resolved at a level beyond their understanding. No clarification followed. No further detail was provided, and perhaps none could be. And then there is 1939, a year defined by events far from this region. Europe on the edge of war, Germany preparing to invade Poland, global attention focused elsewhere. And yet, at that exact moment, two separate expeditions set out toward the same region around Kailash, without coordination, without awareness of each other. One was German, led by Ernst Schäfer, officially presented as a scientific mission to study the environment and local cultures. It was funded through SS channels, which suggests that its purpose may have extended beyond simple research. The other was Soviet, 12 individuals. Their objective classified. No complete public record explaining what they were sent to investigate. The German expedition returned, all members accounted for, carrying collected materials, many of which remain in archives that are not fully accessible. The Soviet group did not. Only 5 members returned. 7 were listed as missing. No detailed explanation was released. 2 major powers. The same year, the same region, different outcomes, and no clear answer as to what either group was truly looking for. At this point, the question shifts again. It is no longer just about anomalies. It becomes about intention. Why this place? Why repeated attention across different periods, different governments, different motivations? Why restricted access? Why incomplete data? Because if these were simply natural irregularities, unusual but ultimately explainable, the expectation would be open study, publication, debate. Instead, what appears repeatedly is limitation, control, and silence. The kind of silence that does not remove the question, but preserves it. And maybe that's where everything begins to settle not into an answer, but into a different kind of understanding. Because after all the observations, all the reports, all the fragments collected over time, Mount Kailash does not reveal itself as a mystery waiting to be solved in a conventional sense. It feels more like a place that exists at the edge of explanation, where different fields, geology, biology, history can approach it, but none of them fully contain it. Each anomaly, taken on its own, can be addressed. The geometry of the mountain can be discussed in terms of structural processes. The biological effects can be approached through environmental stress and adaptation. The lakes can be analyzed through hydrology and mineral balance. The caves and the abandoned city can be studied through archaeology and historical reconstruction. Individually, there are pathways toward explanation. But when these elements are placed side by side, within the same region, within the same radius, something shifts. It becomes harder to treat them as isolated, not because they prove a single theory, but because they create a pattern that feels incomplete, not random, not fully connected, but not entirely separate either. And that space in between where things don't fully align but don't fully disconnect is where the sense of mystery remains. There is also something else that stands out, quietly, beneath all of this. The consistency of restraint. For centuries, people have come here. They have walked around the mountain. They have observed it, described it, written about it. But they have not crossed a certain line. Not in large numbers, not in any sustained way. Even when technology made it possible, even when permission, briefly, seemed within reach, something held. Whether that something is belief, respect, cultural continuity, or simply an unspoken boundary that people choose not to cross it, has proven more durable than any external control. And that, in itself, is unusual. Because in most places, curiosity eventually pushes through. Limits are tested, barriers are removed. But here, the boundary remains. And perhaps that is part of what defines this place. Not just what is there, but what is left undone. What is left unmeasured? What is left, deliberately or not, unresolved? It does not mean there is a hidden answer waiting just beneath the surface. It does not mean there is something extraordinary beyond what we already understand. But it does suggest that not every place fits neatly into explanation at the moment we encounter it. Some places take longer. Some require different ways of looking. And some remain open, not because they cannot be studied, but because the conditions around them, both physical and human, do not fully allow it yet. Kailash stands in that space, not as proof of anything specific, but as a reminder that there are still locations on this planet where knowledge feels partial, where questions are not fully resolved, and where the absence of a clear answer is not a failure of understanding, but a sign that the process is still ongoing. And perhaps, for now, that is enough. Not a conclusion, but a pause before the next question begins.